I'm a wellbeing economist. I know it's true because I was interviewed once on television and Hilary Barry introduced me that way with no prompting from my end. But I figured um, it's official, right? A wellbeing economist is an economist who is interested in real people and what actually drives them and how they behave and the things that matter to them.
I think the next time Hilary Barry interviews you, you should be asked to be known as a serious well-being.
I didn't ask anything. I just have to wait for the first time. I'm just hoping that will gradually percolate up through the media as they consider the serious issues that New Zealand has to grapple with. And obviously, in addition to a housing crisis and a climate crisis, the correct labelling of wellbeing economists is really important.
But this is nothing that you're really holding your breath about, is it?
No, I have to say, probably after the housing crisis and climate crisis have been knocked off, probably in that order, I think we get to the labelling of wellbeing economists crisis.
What is an indicator?
An indicator is a statistic that tells you something about changes in an outcome that you care about, in particular ones, and which has usually a good/bad interpretation. So an indicator captures the direction of change of something.
What does that have to do with housing?
So in the context of something like measuring housing or well-being, right? A statistic can be anything, right? How many people there are in New Zealand, what proportion are a particular age fall in an age group. An indicator is something that tells you about the direction which you're moving towards a goal or an outcome that you care about.
Or away from.
Yeah, or away from, absolutely.
Like home ownership.
Yes.
Yes. Awesome. So Conal, tell me about family well-being. How do you define it?
There are two, so I don't have a definition of this. I think the most interesting, there are two approaches to this, right? You can think of at one level, you can think of family well-being as the well-being of the people in the family. Or you can try and say, what is a family? So I know Judith Davies talks about family well-being being a family which is fulfilling the roles of a family well. Partly, I think this is a metaphysical distinction that doesn't really matter a lot. Nobody has ever shown me an example, or even a hypothetical one, of a family that has high family well-being, where the members have low well-being. And similarly, we're massively social creatures, right? You're not going to show me a group of family people where they all have high individual well-being, but their relationships with each other are completely buggered.
Is well-being different for Maori and non-Maori?
The interesting thing, I think, here, and I always find this interesting because I sort of data thing, is when we designed Te Kupinga, the Māori Social Survey back in 2013, and you sit down and you talk and say, okay, so what is at the heart of Māori approaches to wellbeing? The first thing is don't start from individuals. You start from the collective, right? Whānau. So we sat down and we developed a subjective question on whānau wellbeing, which as far as I know is just about the only one in the world. So there's the subjective wellbeing measures on happiness, life satisfaction, there's international standards on them, they're widely used. To try and actually get people to answer something, a single subjective question, how is your whānau wellbeing, no one's done.
So that would have solved it, right?
We asked this question in Te Kupinga. A few people have looked at it. Arthur Grimes looked at it a bit, I've looked at it a bit. I know Andrew Spall and Tahu Kukatai did some work on it. Basically, it seems to be doing something, but we're not quite sure what.
What were you expecting?
So in our heads, when it was developed, right, it would capture the family unit as a whole. It doesn't seem, when we look at that question, to pick up information about the respondent. It's almost like they've answered a question around themselves. So you ask me about whānau wellbeing, and say, okay, it's not about me, it's about something else. And there are two theories. There's only at this stage theories. One lot says, okay, it's about people are probably answering it about the relationships between family members. The other possibility is that people are responding on how is the rest of my family doing other than me. I sometimes look at this, not so much doubt about when I talk to people who know about what they say about Maori views of well-being, but sometimes I think we have a very reductive and individualistic view of Western well-being, which actually doesn't fit with what most people actually.
I'm not sure about that. I think we don't understand that white people here are different from white people in other parts of the world.
That is a possibility. That's something
Yeah.
which I've, yeah.
Because, you know, I've done stuff in the States where I've talked about whānau.
Yeah.
And my American colleagues have said, what do you mean? They've asked me to explain family, and they just don't get family.
Yeah.
How do you think the family's getting on that has this brick pathway?
The literature, the academic literature on inferring well-being from snapshots on brick paths is, as far as I can tell, a pretty thin literature, right? Big part of our housing crisis is tied to NIMBYism. And a big part of that, I think, is that we build really, really ugly houses these days, right? There is no modern architects design houses that are very, very individual focused. So people inside, they're lovely spaces to live in. And to everyone else around, they are ugly. They're horrible series of, at best boxes stacked on each other, but you wouldn't want to look at next to you. So what I see in that path is somebody who cares about what the path looks like with the little bricks alternating.
That was a pretty tricky one, and you nailed it.
So do you prefer more evidence in your work than a photograph of a path?
If I'm honest. I mean, evidence doesn't solve everything, right? Evidence helps, and there is a problem with it that Fiona, who's got a background in evaluation, will be aware of. That the better the quality of your evaluation, the narrower the range of circumstances to which it applies, and you end up with this gold standard, fur-lined, ocean-going evaluation that only applies to the exact thing that it was evaluating and can't be generalized anywhere else. So there is always this trade-off between, you want to use evidence, that's part of what you're doing, but when you're making a decision, there is no, when you're making any of these decisions, there's a role for evidence, there is a role for theories and models of how the world worked. There is a role for lived experience. And so, so I know that, you've got a theory that says that, so your model's been tested empirically. It's nuts. I know you need to bring all these things together in decision making, and, sort of a experience in government. I think this is badly articulated, but fundamentally, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to shed light on a thing from through different lenses, from different positions. I just find evidence really, really interesting. So,
what about when we actually shedding light on an issue? Our understanding of what the problem is so important as well. Yeah, that's that position we actually start from.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're understanding what the problem is matters, and actually, you talk about, sort of, well, you've got evidence and my lived experiences, that's nuts. That's usually because somebody's actually gone away and got evidence on something completely different and is presenting it as an answer to this problem. Most of the time when I look at things, you have somebody who knows about something and says, look, I think it's this way, and you have evidence which shows something else. 9 times out of 10, it's because the evidence is actually about something else when you scratch the surface.
So if you think about like well-being and housing, what are some of the nutty things, that connections that people have made that you go like, huh?
So we talked, for example, about the recent tax on mortgage interest, and you've got a whole lot of journalists the next day going out finding landlords who are about to evict tenants because so this is not true. Yes, there were landlords who were about to evict their tenants. There were landlords who were about to evict their tenants before the tax went in. This is not a causal relationship. You could at any point in New Zealand's history, I suspect, since people have been here, go out and find some landlord somewhere, certainly since we've had landlords, who were about to evict their tenants. This is and in some cases, it may be because the tenants themselves were difficult. And in some cases, I suspect it's because the landlords were extremely difficult or wanting to do something. And in some cases, sort of perfectly reasonable, somebody's returning home and wanting to use their house again. But whatever the reason is, it wasn't driven, the way the media were presenting this as a causal story was simply garbage.
Fantastic. I think actually that's a great answer. And I've put your score on the back of an envelope because we got to score this. And I've given you 8.3 out of 8.4.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm very happy with that. I'm very happy with that, yeah.
Just a 0.1, just a little bit of jargon would have been nice.
Okay, I'll note that. More jargon. I love hearing that.
And massive congratulations, Conal. That's by far the highest mark that we've had so far on your episode.
Oh, that's the only mark you had on my episode, I think. Or are you telling me the 15 points you mentioned earlier, I forget for what, you didn't mention the scale, did you? That was like 15 out of 150.
Guessing.
A true well-being economist's answer.
You say that, but you realise that the thing I went to do that took me first to the OECD as a wellbeing economist was to write guidelines on the measurement of subjective wellbeing. And like a huge chunk of that was actually literally sitting there thinking about what is the best scale for measuring this? What are the relative merits of a 0 to 10 point scale versus a 0 to 7 point scale versus a 5-point labeled Likert scale? For some omission, which I feel deeply guilty, we missed the 8.4 point scale, Fiona.
Yeah.
If there's a revised edition, we'll have to come back to that.
We've got some questions coming in on the text message here, but just before we do, can I ask, because you seem to infer something, do you think there's a problem with the way our media uses evidence in its housing commentary?
There is a huge problem there, I think, at the moment, and there is a very strong sense of, sort of views differ on the shape of the world. You get a flat earther and you get someone else and you present them as, okay, there's two views on this. I remember quite literally watching something on the media where you had the article on house prices have gone up again. Here's a person who thinks it's a bad thing. Here's a person who thinks it's a good thing and a good thing for everyone. There is no credibility. It's a good thing if you happen to already own assets and you have no children or anyone else in your family who's going to be negatively affected and you plan to die before our social fabric erodes too much. That's a pretty narrow group. Maybe you could say that if you were honest, but you absolutely can't say that, it's good for everything. And yet this just gets reported. So, yeah.
Can you remember ever seeing evidence being used appropriately in New Zealand's media?
It comes up occasionally. That the problem, of course, is that it stands out. So there was that lovely interview that TV3 journalist, I think, did with Jamie Lee Ross just after the election on conspiracy theories and basically, But the horror thing, right, is that in fact the story that she did this was actually a bigger story than the story itself.
Who will do the most harm in the world in the next 3 years?
I was going to nominate Mark Zuckerberg as kind of, sort of Bond villain thing, but actually in many ways he's just a product of, Facebook, the social media, and Facebook is a legal person, right? So my person who I think is the biggest threat at the moment is Facebook, the legal person. Part of the reason our media struggles to do a good job on evidence-based stuff is that our current media model is collapsing, and there are journalists don't actually have the time. I still think they could do better. It's not that hard to say for the story, get two credible people, or if you can't get two credible people, when you introduce them, here's a crackpot, here's the credible view, and present it that way.
So why Facebook? Why pick Facebook as the most dangerous person? I just think we're pushing towards like citizen science, citizen this, citizen the other thing, and Facebook's like citizen media.
Because I worry a lot about feedback bubble, about the bubble, the ability to build your own reality around you, and around the degree to which Facebook pushes that on you. Its algorithms actually drive that and encourage that. The fact that they leverage the sort of algorithms, so Facebook's business model, and this goes to Facebook as a corporate entity. What does Facebook want? Not the people behind it. I think the people who drive it are probably at least in their own eyes, see themselves as pretty reasonable people, even if the consequences are different. But Facebook wants your attention. And we know that from a whole bunch of social psych studies that hearing things that disagree with your immediate view of the world is actually triggers, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's hard to make yourself do. And I know this stuff and I try and make myself do it. And I still am very bad at doing it and don't do enough because the blood pressure rises and you back off. So, Facebook doesn't show people things that don't agree to, the algorithms won't show people things that don't agree with what people already do. And it's driven by attention, right? It makes its money off keeping you locked there. And we know that prodding anger is a very reliable feedback loop there. So there's a degree to which we've created, I think, a little bit of a doom loop machine there.
Doom loop.
It's not the first time. So again, talking this about Brendan, about really obscure tangents. So when the mode of communications in a society changes, it takes a while to adjust. When we had mass broadcast media came into existence, we got Nazi Germany and the totalitarian brand of communism and a really bad mid-20th century. When we invented the printing press, it was even worse, right? We got the wars of religion and the 30 Years' War. It took Europe 150 years to sort itself out after that. I think, sort of Facebook, social media is that scale of change. And you can tell a story where there are positive things that could come out of this in the long run, but we need to figure out a way to manage this that isn't driven by kind of maximizing attention, by making people angry about stuff that they already, that fits within a very narrow world view. So
Conal and Fiona, I'm actually going to give you both marks for that one. And I'm going to give you 2.7.
Out of?
Yeah.
Come on, the scale matters here.
Yeah.
Or it's the scale mystery at the end. You kind of get all the scores on there.
That's a great question. I think it's 2.7 out of 9. About
right.
9.
Yep.
I thought you were saying 2.7% is like the predicted Māori home ownership rate. Nothing actually happens.
You're an optimist. You're an optimist there, aren't you?
Yeah.
2.7 billion is the number of Facebook followers, apparently. I just Googled that, obviously. Nana Google, as Hootie calls her. And I think there's about 9 billion people in the world. So, 2.7 out of 9. But that actually sounds like a really rough mark because your answers were amazing.
Oh, and then you put things over what? You cross out all the zeros, hey? Numerators and denominators.
Yep.
Yeah. Look at your face.
Conal Smith?
Yep.
What is a numerator?
A numerator is the number on top of the dividing line in a fraction.
So it's like the roof of a house.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yes, we got to housing.
Well done.
What is a housing market and why is it so
When we talk about the housing market, there are two markets. There's a market for housing services, which is somewhere to live, and a market for housing as an asset. And the two interact with each other, but they have different drivers. So the market for housing services is it's about somewhere to live, and the price of housing as a service is driven by the supply and demand for houses. So basically, how many whānau are there who need somewhere to live? How many houses are there for them to live in? And the only way you manage that is, to be clear, we have a crisis there in that market at the moment. And the only way we get out of that one is by making more housing available. So building more housing, there's a number of houses tied up in Airbnb for short forms, which, so either basically to sort out the market for housing services, you've either got to build more or pull houses back from places like Airbnb into the actual residential market. The market for housing as an asset, and that drives rent fundamentally, right? So the market for housing as an asset is separate and it has different drivers. It's affected by the level of rent, but it's also affected by interest rates. We have a supply and demand problem that we can build our way out of. And that's going to, that in the long run is how you solve the rent problem. The house price problem is to do with basically interest rates and the asset market. We cannot build our way out of that. No matter how many times politicians, and I've heard politicians from just about every party except the Greens say this, we are not going to solve the affordability of actually buying a house unless we solve the asset problem. And we do that either by getting to a point where interest rates go back up, or we can do it by land value tax. The market isn't distinct from the state. A market is something the state does, right? Markets don't exist without states. Markets require property rights. They require to function effectively. They require enforcement of weights and measures, a whole lot of other stuff. There is no state market dichotomy. And if you want to think sensibly about these things, including ways of delivering housing, you need to acknowledge that and think about it from that perspective.
I actually scored you a numerator of a whare over a denominator of papatuanuku. And I want to know if you know 5 elements of people's right to having a house.
Ooh. It needs to be quality. So you're going to have your right to housing should include housing that is of adequate quality, so, sort of dry, not like one flat I had first flat after moving out of university where we literally had mushrooms growing in the bathroom, like not mold, mushrooms growing in the wall of the bathroom. It was actually quite spectacular. It had an orange cap and a white stalk. It was quite not that big, but it was very colourful. So adequate quality, adequate space, so not crowded. I'm not overcrowded. Security of tenure, I think is an important thing. So you've got to be able to live there, it's got to be affordable. So that's going to be 4. A number of ways you go with 5th one. I'm pretty sure this isn't it, but I think it should be. Or it should be in there somewhere. I think housing should have some component of. They'll put it really. Housing should be beautiful, including the environment it's in. Anywhere you live, right? This is for if you look at it, I can think of there are a number of ways you can put this much better. It sounds less. But if you think about what failed with a lot of social housing experiments in the 60s, the kind of modernist Soviet brutalism thing, they failed partly because that, having somewhere which is actually work. You talk to an urban designer, they won't talk beauty. They'll say somewhere which works, which integrates into the lot, a whole bunch of other stuff. But fundamentally, somewhere which is nice to live.
Shall I provide you with some analysis of your answer, Conal?
Yes.
Righto. Fiona, do you have anything to add, or shall I carry on?
No, carry on. I have got something to add, but I can do that later.
All right. So
It's not funny.
Oh, well, just forget it. You're fired.
So, Conal, participatory policy development.
Yep.
What's the connection in terms of just engaging people in policy development about housing that actually, what's the link there with their well-being?
So one of the things that we've learned that comes through really strongly in well-being, I talked about sort of well-being economics about real people. People care about process. They care about process independently of the outcome. This was the great, probably wasn't always true, but the great stylized thing of economists in the 1980s and 1990s. We're going to do this, and just you don't want to do it, but it will be good for you in the end. Sort of take your medicine. Actually, the process of doing it is inherently valuable in and of itself. So there are at least 2 elements here. One, you should have always looked slightly askance at anyone who says, I believe in markets and the interaction of people making choices produces a good result. Now sit quiet and be quiet while we plan out what's going to happen to you. That's inherently there's something wrong there in that line of logic. There is also this point that process matters in and of itself. How you do things is really, really, really important to people. And we don't want to leave that out. So if you're talking about doing this, I would say, I would expect engaging people will give you a better outcome in terms of the suitability of the final thing. But even if it didn't, even if it was just, no better, but just about the same, it still matters to the people who are doing it. And it's going to be important. And it gives a legitimacy, gives them some mana to the final outcome, which otherwise it doesn't have.
Any thoughts about sovereign policy?
Conal, in 20 seconds or less, can you describe New Zealand's constitution?
New Zealand's constitution has two parts. I think the treaty is clearly an element of it, although it's not a written constitution in the American sense, but none of our constitution is a written constitution in the American sense. And as recent events in America have shown, any constitution is actually about the unwritten internal norms that people have and is only as meaningful as people believe it to be.
I give them 8.4.
Text Justin, why should we care about families being well?
So partly I think because we do by and large. We're a hypersocial creature. The only way you manage to avoid caring about people doing well is either by managing to distance yourself to the point where you don't see it, so hiding it, or by going through quite a rigorous internal process of trying to convince yourself that those people are not really people. There's something different.
Oh, that's that group of people you talked about before, the ones who will be dead soon.
Yeah, them. Yeah. Okay, so baby boomers, for example, don't count.
Well, I think if you're dead soon, you're not really concerned about young Māori, because you're not really concerned about the ability of young Māori to be well educated, well housed, well employed, so they're paying good taxes to keep you in your old age, because you'll be gone.
The fact is, generational politics. Those people care about their kids. Their kids are going to be living in a society with these other kids, and that society needs to be functional for them to have high well-being. This goes back to my concerns around bubbles and our ability to wrap ourselves intellectually around stories, sort of quite narrow stories which reflect our prior beliefs. So if you think that accumulating housing assets is the way to wealth, and you think passing on that wealth to your kids or grandkids is the best way you can protect them and give them high well-being, which you care about because they're your kids, then you don't really want anyone to point out to you that if the other people who are not your kids or grandkids are really, really, really poor, that society is not going to be functional and your kids are not going to do well. You just don't want to know that.
So, Conal, who do you think is most likely to do great good in the world in the next 3 years or so?
So, again, this was I am going to go here for two people. I've got a theme here, right? Two people I'm going to nominate are Te Rawera and Te Whanganui. So if I'm going to pick a legal person as my villain, I'm going to pick legal people for my heroes as well, or doing good. And I think there's two reasons. There are two serious reasons for this. One, when we face a lot of the social problems we face, we tend to talk about how terrible everything is. That is an appalling motivator, right? When you talk, it's one of the big problems I think we have with climate change, that you talk to people, they say, well, the world's ending, it's crap, nothing I can do about it. That doesn't help. What motivates people is a sense that you can change something, that something good can happen. The second substantive point is that, I talked about Facebook as a doom loop, right? We've built an institution whose incentives are to destroy us. And when I say we've created this is a legal, Facebook is a legal person. Te Rawera and Te Whanganui are examples of creating legal people whose incentives are to pursue things that are actually socially beneficial and good for the well-being.
I'm giving you 10 charity Christmas cards for that answer, Conal. That was...
That's a big one. That's a big one. The Christmas card scales are a very well-regarded scale.
Me or Victoria are going to read you a paragraph from a report called An empirical investigation into the determinants of life satisfaction in New Zealand.
Catchy title, yeah?
A simple model of the determinants of subjective well-being in New Zealand is described, and coefficients for the model are estimated using ordinary least squares. The model is re-estimated using an ordered per bit to confirm that the results are not biased due to the ordinal nature of the data.
A preliminary sidebar.
A preliminary sidebar.
What the is an ordinary least square?
Right. It's not a very small square, I have to say at this stage. So ordinary least squares is a statistical technique for looking at when you've got a whole bunch of data, whole bunch of information with lots of different things in the relationship, for trying to estimate. So say you have completely randomly the quality of your housing, its suitability to your family size, its quality of housing, space relative to family members, stability of tenure, and its affordability. And you want to find out how those four things affect overall suitability of housing. And you've asked a whole lot of people, got a whole lot of data points, and we don't know in advance. Ordinary least squares tries to find a weight, if you like, a number for each of those four category elements of housing, which best explains overall housing suitability as they're reported. And it does so by trying to minimise the sum of squared errors.
The model is re-estimated using an ordered per bit to confirm that the results are not biased due to the ordinal nature of the data. The paper finds that demographic factors are largely not significant drivers of well-being in New Zealand and conforms to the international literature in identifying income, unemployment, health status, and social contact as the four main factors affecting subjective well-being.
Conal Smith, well-being economist. What the does that mean?
It means that health, not being excluded from having a job if you want one, adequate social contact are the big things that matter for well-being. Basically, that's all it boils down to. The rest of it is jargon about how we got there. But basically what that is saying is that the stuff that we would probably expect to be important to people's well-being is in fact what is important to people's well-being.
Jason's just texted in to say, do you have any idea why the report authors didn't just write what you said instead?
Because we were trying to get it... I don't know. When I next sit down and talk to them, I can't think who they might be. I have to have words with them. Short answer is that we were trying to get it accepted for the New Zealand Economic Papers, an academic journal, and it was written by a bunch of statisticians.
The main substantive finding to emerge from the analysis relates to the ability to measure well-being outcomes at the policy intervention level. It is possible to provide a meaningful picture of the well-being impact of a policy intervention across the full range of well-being domains. We were able to produce a picture of how outcomes varied across all 12 well-being domains for people placed in social housing, and how these varied before and after being placed in social housing.
Conal Smith, what the does that mean?
Basically, using the data which is sitting there in Statistics New Zealand's IDI, we were able to have a look at the situation before and the situation after, and to see the impact which social housing had. And the thing which was kind of cool with that paper is if you just compare people in social housing to people in private rental, you see that outcomes are by and large worse for people in social housing at an average level. And that might lead you, if you were ignorant or maliciously motivated, say, well, social housing sucks. Why would we do this? Just leave it to the market. So what was quite cool about that bit of work is because we were able to look at where people were coming from. We did this in aggregated levels. This isn't following individual identifiable people. But we were able to look at a group of people where they were before they went into social housing. So you can see, even though the outcomes for social housing aren't as good in a cross-section, people's well-being improved. When people were moving into social housing, their situation went from one that was worse to one that was better.
Well, even though some of our social housing stock is pretty interesting quality, that on the whole, these people were coming from pretty private stock.
Yeah, so pretty much, yeah, that was clear, and it was actually that was a large effect, right? Because we were pushing for that particular paper, we were pushing the bounds of our sample size was quite small by the time we got down to this, using the approach that we did. It was statistically meaningful, but it was at the lower end of it. So it needed to be a really big effect to show through. And improvements in housing quality showed through consistently. So that is telling you unambiguously that the people who were getting placed in social housing were experiencing an improvement in housing quality, even though, as we point out, a proportion of our social housing stock is quite old and hasn't been upgraded.
Has or will the relabeling of our government budget as a wellbeing budget make any difference?
Good question.
No. He says the relabeling will not. What I really care about and what I would like to see more of is more substantive engagement from the central government agencies in the evidence.
If you were a wellbeing economist in New Zealand right now, would you be able to point to some structural change that has gone along with the wellbeing budgets?
I've seen three things which are particularly useful. None of them are quite where I would like them to be. There have been improvements in in measuring and trying to get a handle on because most of what government does is purchase stuff that isn't well measured by dollars. The cost of, looking at the cost of what the government is to provide something tells you nothing about how valuable it was. So we have seen bit more recognition, a bit more focus to actually trying to say, okay, so what are we buying? What is it achieving? It's surrounded often by layers of waffle or extremely overcomplicated frameworks, but there is something genuine there, and that helps. There is a number of individual examples of agencies here and there trying to figure out and say, okay, what is the impact of this on well-being? It's not a systematic thing across the whole government, and there are gaps in it, but there are examples here and there which are quite good. The two big things are actually a little bit less expected. One is there is something about which is actually quite useful in getting central government officials talking about well-being, and that's it does make them talk to each other and try and agree what it is. And one of the problems you have with civil service is, and I always pick on Ministry of Health for this, and it's totally unfair because they're not actually worse than anyone else. But if you're the Ministry of Health, you tend to look at health as the outcome with a capital T and a capital O, right? And everything else, if you think of it at all, you only think of it as social determinants of health or the equivalent. But the fact is, mental health problems are a huge driver of labour market problems for people and poverty, which matter in their own right. So actually getting officials to sit there and talk to each other and say, okay, look, and some of this happens, but I do think framing things around well-being, Treasury's living standards framework, helps structure and encourage those conversations to take place. There's some really interesting stuff happening in the regions in New Zealand. So we focus... When you talk about the wellbeing budget, you focus on central government and what's happening there, but actually what central government signals causes things to happen at other levels and other bodies in New Zealand. So two of the things I've been working on, this is just what I've seen, stuff I'm doing with the Trust Tairāwhiti, right? The Trust is taken very seriously. They want to invest for the wellbeing of people. Tairāwhiti, it's actually in their deed. And because they're smaller, because they're not the entire sort of monolith of a New Zealand central government, once they decide to do it, they can go a lot further and a lot faster. And so the stuff they're doing has been really interesting. They've been able to go, there's a small, you can get the people you need to agree to do something in a room and hold them hostage there and feed them a catered lunch until they agree to do it, and you've got agreement to do it. So there are a bunch of spin-offs, I think, outside central government, which are quite good examples of what you can do and which are real, will have a real impact. There's a lot of what goes on in New Zealand goes on at the local level. We talk about a housing crisis. You can't talk about a housing crisis without talking about local government, and it's planning and infrastructure decisions.
So is the lesson, or a lesson, that it's really good that the government's a little bit slow because there's these windows of opportunity for regional stuff?
I don't know if it's good that it's slow because I don't have a counterfactual. Our handling of the COVID crisis, on the whole, probably fits the description of a fast, good government. And globally, despite lots of individual countries making appalling decisions, developing a vaccine or a series of vaccines, something like this, within 1 year, no other disease in the history of the human race has ever faced an outcome from the disease's point, which is this bad, right? So there are examples, I think, sort of doing things collectively on a large scale, good, fast. All budgets are wellbeing budgets. There has never, ever been a budget the Treasury has done where the Minister of Finance has not been aware that people care about their well-being. Getting to be Minister of Finance in a democratic country requires you to know what people actually care about. Oh, that's not at all happy with that.